I am pleased to welcome Karen VanAusdal. Welcome. How are you?
Wonderful. Thank you, Emily. So pleased to be here
Great.
and excited to be with all of you. We are really thrilled to be doing this series on adult SEL. And we know, this is a moment when the focus on adult SEL is critical for our educators, for our family members, for our communities. And we're just thrilled to have you here. So thank you.
I'll just give a brief introduction to Karen. She is Vice President of Practice at CASEL, and she's going to be leading our learning today. And Karen oversees the work of CASEL's practice team to support and scale high-quality systemic SEL implementation in service of equity and excellence for all young people. She works to advance the learning and support efforts of key CASEL initiatives such as the SEL Fellows Academy, the Collaborating Districts Initiative, and other key district and school partnerships. So we are excited to have here today, and I will go ahead and turn things over.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everyone. So we wanted to start with a slightly different tone as we talk about adult SEL. That means that all of us are activating our own SEL. So let's begin. Just take a moment to think of a time when you have exercised your own social emotional learning competencies in the last few days. Was there something that helped you to do that? Was there something that hindered you from doing that? So take a pause, take a deep breath to really get yourself into this space of learning and collaboration with each other, and think about this question for just a moment. Feel free to jot that down. I know as I think about this, I was thinking about my own self-management and the relationship skills that I brought into play as just preparing for this webinar and really connecting with the folks on the screen to bring a high quality learning experience to all of you. So we hope that we hit that mark today. So we wanted to start with our definition of SEL, but bring a new lens to it in thinking about adult SEL. So as you look at this definition, we are really thinking about this shared process of human development that happens across the lifespan. You'll also see we highlighted here this focus on the partnership between school, family, and community. And when we think about adult SEL, we're thinking about building skills and well-being that contributes to thriving communities. So this partnership really is the one that allows us to establish those trusting relationships and really bring the meaningful learning experiences for both young people and for adults in these spaces. So which adults are we talking about? Where does adult SEL live? I think as we look at the rings here, we have really tried to expand our understanding of what we mean when we're talking about adult SEL. And all of these contexts have to be attended to when we talk about adult SEL. We're not just talking about teachers, we're not just talking about school staff, but really thinking about family, community members. And by broadening this way that we approach adult SEL, we really pave the way to more authentic partnerships and ones that maximize the strengths that every adult in a young person's life is bringing to the table in terms of their learning and development. And the research supports this as well. SEL is not just for students. There are shown demonstrated benefits for adults, both inside the classroom and outside of the classroom. And, particularly as we at CASEL have been reflecting at this moment around the data we're seeing from adults, we're hearing from educators that over 90% are feeling burned out in their career right now, 90% noting that stress is a serious problem in their daily lives. So we see from some of this data that a focus on adult SEL can begin to mitigate some of these stressors. So building empathy, patience, trust for teachers and other school staff allows them to, in turn, build stronger relationships with their students to truly model that social, emotional, cultural competence for students, as we know is key to their learning. And as someone who's had the privilege of working with districts over this past decade to really look at what does it mean to build systemic SEL into school districts across the country, we hear from them time and time again that, if I could go back and do it again, and even in my own reflection as a former district leader, how we would have focused more on the adult SEL. I think there's an urgency and a sense of wanting to build programming and structures for students, but really thinking about the ways that adults embodying this work allows it to have much more meaning and connection with the students that are in all of their lives as well. So let's take a look and think about CASEL's model for adult SEL. And we really have sort of three pillars of this model. So the first is learn. We are doing that right now. This is about understanding the theory and the practice of SEL, and in turn being able to support student SEL. So part of that learning is also self-reflection. It's creating professional learning or engagements for all adults in a learning ecosystem, and really building that into the day-to-day of how we interact with one another. The second is connect and collaborate. So this is where we really put those skills into practice. And it may look like learning communities. It can look like embedding SEL practices into your staff meetings, into community meetings, family connections. There may be more formalized peer mentorship for staff at a school or consultancies in which we're collectively problem solving with one another. It's really ensuring that we have the shared language of SEL across all of the layers that are supporting our young people. And then the third is modeling. So this is the type of learning and experience that's happening all of the time, whether we are being intentional about it or not, and really ensuring that as we build that intention, that all of our interactions are putting these skills into place, are demonstrating the types of mindsets that we're talking about. And this allows for the learning of both young people and adults. And we also encourage here thinking about ways that SEL can be built into leadership practice. So as we've been thinking about SEL for adults, we at CASEL have really anchored much of our current work in what we call the 5 focal constructs. And if you've joined us for some of our previous webinars, you may have heard about some of these, but let's bring a lens of adult SEL to our thinking about them. So these are the focal constructs that are critical when thinking of SEL in service of equity and excellence. So just like when we talk about the 5 competencies, these are deeply interconnected. So it's hard to separate these individually, but we'll think about how we do that in our practice. And for adults to feel a sense of well-being, in addition to building those skills we've been talking about, attending to these focal constructs and their competencies is key. And when we do, we know that we see those impacts for adults and their ability to support the same skills and the same elements of learning environments for young people. So the first one that we'll take a look at is self-awareness. So, and this focal construct is that connected to self-awareness is identity. So identity is the critical foundation upon which we build these effective school communities and our community and our ability to understand ourselves. And we know that identity is not just one piece. There's multiple layers to identity, and that we bring all of those layers to our relationships, to our work, to the way that we connect with one another. So part of this adult SEL work is really recognizing and affirming those varied aspects of our identity. We think about that for students, but adults need that just as much in their environments as students do. So we know that that identity is foundational to learning. You know, as we approach new content, as we approach new interactions, we are bringing those experiences, the background that we have. So this can look like teachers who have their identities affirmed and then are able to affirm student identities. And then we've seen that that really allows the space then for staff, families, teachers to show that genuine care and respect for each student, and to really see the knowledge, the life experiences, and the culture that students are bringing as assets to their classroom community, just as we hope those same assets are seen for the adults in their communities. The second piece we'll look at is agency, closely tied to self-management. And often you'll hear us talk about agency as voice, choice, ownership for students in classrooms, but really adults are craving those same elements in their experiences and in their realms. So agency honors that expertise we all have in ourselves, in our ability to direct ourselves to our goals and to collective goals. And this is not just for those in traditional leadership, but how do we bring those spaces so that all of us can be helping to solve problems we face at a given school community. So this can look like teachers helping to design their own professional learning opportunities, which we have seen can improve teacher morale, can improve student achievement. And the more that we actualize our own strengths, it really sets the stage for adults to then share responsibility with students or share responsibility with caregivers to really be co-learners, which is something we talk a lot about. The third is belonging, connected to social awareness. And the research has told us repeatedly that a sense of connectedness, of being part of something greater than ourselves, is critical to our well-being and really our ability to thrive. So belonging is anchored in the identity and the agency we just talked about, because bringing our full selves to building relationships and spaces of learning with our peers and with young people and families is really where those three start to interact with one another. Collaborative problem solving, which is tied to relationship skills, this is our fourth focal construct, is that space of co-creation of solutions. So how, as we reflect, do we move into a space of more authentic partnerships across school, family, community? And as we build that mutual trust, that mutual respect, open communication, then we can truly work towards improving practices and solving problems using all of that strength and all of that wisdom of adults across the ecosystem. And then finally, we land on curiosity. And this one is tied to responsible decision making, because this is about how do we make informed decisions where we're testing our assumptions. We're bringing that true open-minded inquiry to our relationships, to our students, to our colleagues, and really to ourselves. So can we be genuinely curious in our reflections on our behavior, on the behavior of others, and move away from that space of judgment? I think this is really one that's sort of tapping into that deep human need to consider as we build spaces that truly nurture adult SEL. And I think self-compassion has been something we've been talking quite a bit about as part of curiosity, and really prerequisite to any meaningful growth. So how do we actually allow ourselves to reflect on our practice with humility, to look at data, to make changes in ways that may be challenging, but bring a genuine curiosity to ourselves and to others, and even to partner with those that we may not have partnered with before. So for our school leaders, what can this look like to invest time, resources into truly learning from families, your staff, your students, and your community to lead with curiosity? So we've given you a lot to think about, and we want to embed some of these adult SEL practices into our time together. So let's pause again here. Let's reflect. Is there one way that you're seeing your school, your organization, building these types of practices of identity, agency, belonging, collaborative problem solving, and curiosity into your day-to-day life? If so, how could you build on that? If not, is there a place that you can begin to grow and make intentional some of these practices? So I'll give you a moment to think about that. And with that, I am thrilled to invite Dr. Kim Schonert-Reichl to the screen with me. Dr. Schonert-Reichl is the Novo Foundation Endowed Chair in Social Emotional Learning in the Department of Psychology at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and is also a CASEL board member and a trusted colleague for myself. So welcome, Kim. So pleased to have you here. And I think you could probably talk for hours on this topic, so would love to hear from you as an expert in this field for many decades. What are you seeing as key advances in the learning and in the practice of adult SEL right now? Thanks again, Kim.
Karen, so great to be with you today and with everyone here. This is one of my favorite topics. I have been in this area for a few decades, starting off as a teacher in the early 80s in both middle school and high school, and then working in teacher preparation and teacher education for a few decades. So it really is an important topic and really is one that is critical. And I see, just as we're sort of looking at this, having seen the field for this long time, really it's in the past decade and really the past few years where I've seen such increased attention to particularly educator well-being and adult SEL. A decade ago, this was rarely a topic. It wasn't something really discussed. We always just focused on students. And I think what's happened is there's kind of three reasons I believe there's been such an increase. I think number one, we've seen through recent polls, especially of our educator workforce, recent Gallup poll showed that 52% of educators reported extreme stress and burnout, highest among than any other profession. Even doctors and nurses, so this is really concerning, this idea, but even raising the attention of the teacher stress and burnout. And actually, another recent report from the National Education Association that was just done in 2022 found that 55% of its members are going to leave the profession earlier than expected, given the COVID pandemic and other stresses. And so what we're seeing is a really ominous future for the teaching profession as we look at teachers leaving the profession much earlier than intended. And so we really have to be concerned. And we know there's a recent U.S. Surgeon General's report as well in December 2021 that showed rising increases among students' mental health, which has an effect on teachers as well. We've also seen, I think, in response to this highlighting the importance of adult SEL, it's increased the number of programs out there to address intentionally and specifically adult SEL. A number of Committee for Children has one, Panorama, Transforming Education, a number of programs like Mind Up, which is a program for students, now has one for educators. And so we're seeing there's a program called CARE, Cultivating Awareness and Resiliency in Education. So we're just seeing a really increase in these programs dealing intentionally with that. And I think, and I just want to say, I feel that there's in the future, perhaps like the CASEL program guide has for SEL programs for students, we'll see a parallel one of SEL programs for adults. I just want to say that will be needed because, well, although we've seen an increase in programs and a number we haven't seen the same increase in evaluations of those programs. Although that is something that's kind of my third thing is we have now really a much more solid evidence-based of the importance of adult SEL, particularly educator SEL, and its impact on students. So I think those are some things I've really seen, and it's really so really important to see these. I'm just delighted that so many of this focuses, and then this webinar series to have the specific 4-part webinar series from CASEL on this topic.
Yeah, as are we, Kim, and you highlight sort of the urgency for this work as well, both on behalf of our adults and our students. So thank you for that. And I think to your last point around what is that connection that we're seeing between focusing on adult SEL and actual student learning outcomes for students. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've heard from several people, there's been increased focus on adult SEL and self-care and programs that address that. However, there has been some skepticism from others saying, well, okay, we're promoting the teacher's well-being, but does it have any impact on students? Because people really want to say that, especially in the school setting, how does focusing on the adult going to lead to improvements in the students as well? And we have seen a number of studies that have come out recently really making that link. There's a study that was done early on a few years ago that looked at teachers' own stress and burnout actually led to higher rates of internalizing and externalizing disorders in their classrooms. There was an association between that. Teachers with higher stress and burnout and students with more anxiety and depression. There's research that a colleague and I, Ava Oberle, did where we wanted to look at stress contagion in the classroom to see if teachers who are stressed is it associated with students' well-being. And what we did is we looked at 4th to 7th grade classrooms and asked teachers to complete a measure of their own stress and burnout. But then to look at the students' well-being and stress, we decided to really look at their stress physiology, like how get under the skin. So we actually collected their cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone, which we know we all have a healthy pattern of cortisol. It peaks about a half an hour after awakening, then decreases the rest of the day. But if you're really stressed, your cortisol levels remain quite high. And what we found was fascinating. Well, first of all, let's just say that to collect the cortisol from the students, we actually had to get their saliva. Yes, we collected spit from hundreds of 4th to 7th grade students. And by the way, they loved it.
Sure.
They loved it. Well, they loved actually, I kind of joke, but they actually really loved just learning about the science of stress. And it was a really good way to get into the research and get the buy-in from them. But what was fascinating is we found that those classrooms with teachers who self-reported the highest levels of stress and burnout had students with the highest levels of cortisol, indicative of high stress levels. Now, we don't know if it was teachers coming to the classroom, having high levels of stress and that passing it on to students? Or was it students coming into the classroom with many more stress, anxiety, and teachers were catching that? But to me, it really made the case that, if you're going to focus on trying to create the well-being of students, you have to have the adults there. Hence the, the CDI results. Like, we wish we would have started with the adults. And I think and then there's a recent study just hot off the press by a group out of Australia, looking at the link between teacher stress and burnout and students' academic achievement, and found across like 39 elementary schools, 400 and more teachers, that those teachers who had more emotional exhaustion had students with lower academic achievement. So we're seeing more and more. Now, I have to say the reverse because I'm focusing on the negative. So I have to give you some positive here. But we have found that, in fact, for example, the Tish Jennings and her colleagues who did a study of a program called CARE, Cultivating Awareness and Resilience in Education, that is a mindfulness program for teachers about their own well-being, that in a large-scale randomized controlled trial experimental study in New York, they found that that program not only increased teachers' well-being and a number of aspects of their time urgency and things like that. But they found, and it was a randomized study, that those classrooms in which teachers had gotten the CARE program for themselves, so it wasn't a program for the students, it was a program just for themselves, they actually changed the classroom context to one that was much more positive and increased academic achievement as well. So so we know that what's so fascinating about that, a program just for teachers actually changes the students as well. So I think that's fascinating.
It is fascinating, Kim. And I think, we'd love to think more about what are some of those other innovative practices. People are wondering, how can I build this into my school, my community right away? Are there some innovative practices that you're seeing in your context?
Yeah, so a number, so I was, I'll just mention where I was. I'm now in Chicago. I moved back home to Chicago. I'm originally from Chicago, and I think I might have my Chicago accent back. I was in Canada for 30 years, so maybe some of my Canadian accent.
A little bit.
I was a professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada for 30 years, working in the Faculty of Education. And what I saw in British Columbia were quite a number of innovations. First of all, in 2016, they legislated the inclusion of SEL, or social and personal competencies, across the entire province in all K-12 curriculum. So that really had that happen. But most recently, they now really have across province-wide adopted a focus on adult SEL. They have programs that are free and available through the Ministry of Education for all teachers to have programs on their own well-being. They're also incorporating a new program. I don't know if anyone's heard of it, by Peter Senge and his colleague Meta Bowl out of MIT, called Compassionate Systems Awareness, where the leaders actually learn how do you create a compassionate system among the adults, and of course the downstream onto the students for that. And again, that is something that's rolling out across the province. And a number of schools, I love this. I was just looking at some titles of across the province of their districts, and they actually have like a district leader on wellness, on well-being, or the healthy school coordinator, whose job, in line with the district administration in terms of math and curriculum, along with that, is just focused on promoting the well-being of both the students and the educators, and not just the educators, I have to say all of the adults in the system. So I did a talk there a few years ago in this district 67, and on adult SEL. And this is pre-pandemic, so it was been about 2017, something like that, 2018. The attendance at the session was everyone: the electricians, the custodians, the secretaries. Everyone was there for a full day, just focused on wellness and well-being. So I think that idea of really taking a system-wide approach to focus on we are all being well. And then just, if I think about what advice I'd have for schools, is just raising the conversation about talking about that. I know I even, I don't know if you've heard of these 3 signature practices, Karen.
Yeah.
I love your video on them. But I talk about every staff meeting, every meeting should always start with that, with a welcome inclusion, with a break, with a sort of in between kind of break time, with an optimistic closure. How do you create those systems where everyone feels they belong? And I have to say, and I'll just make one other comment here, and I could certainly go on a bit. A lot of people talk about self-care, and I think that is so critical, but taking those moments for yourself. There was one principle that it was during the pandemic, but he's continued it on, where if teachers during their break time wanted to go take a walk with a colleague and have their meeting that way, to be open to trying to leave these conventional ways of sitting in you're only working if you're sitting in an office, and really thinking about, but with the school leader actually allowing for that to happen, I think is so critical. But however, and that kind of gets to that, we talk about self-care, but I actually think there's something about the supportive relationships. The more we support one another and work together and have those buddies and have those mentors and have that go-to person among the adults. We talk about them for the students, if have a go-to person at the school, but why don't we as adults have a go-to person for us? So I think, those are some things. And I just do also want to mention of our CASEL Weisberg Scholars. We have an amazing CASEL Weisberg Scholars program. Innovators in SEL, it's early career scholars in the field. We're going to just a bit of a highlight, although you'll be the first to know, we're going to be opening the next cohort May 1st. So just so you all know, but we have some amazing CASEL Weisberg scholars who are, Summer Braun is one who's doing some amazing research looking at the link between teachers' mindfulness and students' well-being in the classroom. Julia Mahfouz, who has been doing some great work, has a whole brief on principles, which again, we need to focus on. I do want to say, I feel like we don't talk enough about the administrators, and I feel that they bear a huge burden that we really need to address. And then finally, I haven't talked that much about parents, but we need to really help parents and bring them in. And I don't think there's as much work in that area as I believe there should be.
Yeah, I mean, you elevated so many pieces that have my mind firing now. I think, I'm grateful to you for noting, I think there's a lot of conversation about self-care, and there's certainly value in self-care, but how do you systematize that? How do you build that into structure so that it's not, the onus is not on an individual, but that we're building a system that is caring for adults? And to your points on administrators, we've seen some of our districts creating circles for their principals, for their assistant principals, so that they have that space to, practice the circles that we're doing with students, but also to really connect with one another, to do that collaborative problem solving, to bring their full identities and sense of belonging into those spaces. So we're also working with some districts and counties to do this deep dives into these focal constructs with their leaders, so that they are then coming into their design of social emotional learning and their implementation of it with their own experience from it. So yeah, thank you for elevating all of those. And I think you touched on a piece that I know we had a question from one of our participants today around, you talked about these positions around wellness and well-being. How do you connect that to educator social emotional competence? Is that one and the same? Are they different? How would you frame that for folks?
That's such a great question. A lot of people we talk about SEL and mental health and SEL and well-being, and what is the relationship between that? Well, there's been a number of studies really showing that teachers who are stressed and burned out, who have anxiety, depression, don't have the same kind of social emotional competencies. For example, if you think of self-management and you think of that construct of being able to manage your emotions, if you're not able to do that, you have lower well-being. So we find that if you have these social and emotional competencies like self-awareness, even being aware of, like, what are my triggers? What are the things that really set me off, and how can I be more intentional in thinking about those? Even thinking about, Karen, your first question to have people, reflect on was that idea of thinking about how your own social emotional skills has kind of helped you with something. And we know that they are really important for well-being. And I'll just reflect, so I just on a bit of a story, I'll just tell you, because I had a really interesting beginning. I taught in an alternative high school for adolescents at risk. I taught there for 3 years, and Downers Grove, Illinois, and these were adolescents who had many problems. They were 7th grade to high school. Well, many of them hadn't, but they came in with so many stresses. They came in with, that had failed many grade levels. I was the reading teacher. They were, some of them over the weekend have been arrested, or they were, sleeping on the streets, or, there were just so many things. And as a new teacher, they would come in, and I did not have I think two things. I didn't have the self-awareness, or I had a lot of social awareness. I have to say, I had a lot of empathy, because I kind of just was so overwhelmed with all of their problems and wanted to help them. And I wasn't able to really be able to draw from other strategies to help me cope with that. And so this is reflecting on, I guess almost 40 years ago. I had a lot of physical ailments. I had like hives, and I had stomach aches, and I had headaches, and I had all these things. But guess what? I never made a connection between those symptoms and my dealing with all the stress of those kids. And so it really, my own lack of these social emotional competencies really, really affected my well-being, my physical health, actually. But then I went to another place to work, and I was working in a residential treatment institution for kids with severe emotional and behavioral disorders, where I actually lived and worked for 3.5 years with them. However, there was such a focus in this institution on the adult well-being. So much was about us taking care of ourselves. We even had like a support person. I had a social worker who I met every week in session, who was just all about supporting me. And I just had that contrast to say, on the one hand, of all the repercussions for my own well-being versus having that support and that ability. So I feel that, I know it's just an example, but it really just showed for me that experience of being able to know what is it like when you actually have a focus on adult well-being. And mind you, that was so many years ago, and kind of really out of the ordinary.
Yeah. And how do we make that not out of the ordinary, right? So that we are explicit about, yes, we need to take time for this. So this is valuable to us as a school community, broader community, whatever it may be. So getting that permission, I think we've heard a lot from leaders and teachers, like, I just want permission to be able to focus on this, knowing that it ultimately serves our young people and the ultimate goals of our school. So yeah, thank you for sharing that, Kim. Appreciate it.
I'm just going to say one more thing, and this is just something, a practical thing. I think that this information about the relation between teacher well-being and social emotional competencies, and the relationship between teacher SEC, social emotional competencies, and well-being, and its relation to students, is not well known in the public. I think this is going to be one of the biggest barriers. So if you have a program that comes in, and I've seen this happen, on teacher well-being, there's kind of an outcry from the public saying, we're paying taxpayer dollars to have teachers do this, do yoga in the morning. And so we really need a public information campaign showing these the evidence of this importance. Anyway, so there's a bit of my soapbox. Sorry about that.
Yeah, love that, Kim. And I also want to give you, we're going to switch to Q&A from our participants in a couple of moments, but I want to give you a chance, because I think you're doing incredibly groundbreaking research and work, and something that I have a big heart for, which is teacher preparation programs, and really how do we include social emotional learning into those teacher preparation programs and processes. So I would love for you to share a few words on that, if you could.
Yeah, it's an incredible area. I really started, so at University of British Columbia, when I was there, which I believe 14 years ago, we started the first ever teacher preparation program with a focus on SEL. At that time, we were so lucky that we had a dean in our faculty of education. We had colleagues who were willing to go along with it. We actually had some funding too that helped us get it started. And that program has become very popular, and I think actually has led to the widespread integration of SEL into schools across British Columbia. Because you imagine, if you have a pipeline of people who are being trained in this as teacher candidates, and then going into schools, it really helps to scale up really quickly. And I think, and what we focused on, and I think what these programs, and so first of all, I will say, we really focused on not just the educator teaching this to students, but also their own well-being. So that was part of it from the start. What we've seen now is actually just in the past few years, I've seen such an increase in attention to this. And in fact, in a couple of weeks, and you'll be there, Karen, the first ever convening focus specifically of a think tank. So it's a small group. It's funded by the Spencer Foundation, to thank them so much for it, of a think tank about integrating transformative SEL into educator preparation to advance racial equity. And we are bringing leaders from across the country. Nancy Markowitz is one of them, some people from Learning Policy Institute, all coming together to talk about how to do this. And there's amazing innovations happening right now that really, and I think how the field, what I love about how the field has really, from our first SEL and teacher preparation, we're now really talking about transformative SEL and really talking about this idea of advancing equity. And so I think these three things coming together. So it's something that's, it's grown quite a lot in the past few years. It's nowhere where we need to it. There's no kind of, what we're hoping to have is some sort of community, because right now there's efforts happening kind of popcorn style all across the country, and none of them know kind of what the other is doing, and we could learn so much. But I think it's a really important direction that we need to go. And I'll make one comment, and I hope there's some school administrators or directors of school districts here. We really need to think about, once we build these programs, how we right from the start have university school district partnerships that are really around this. And because guess what? Every teacher candidate has to do a student teaching practicum. So why not bring the district's efforts on social emotional learning and adult SEL, partner with the university, and just kind of bring them all together?
Right. Well, I'm thinking about the need to retain teachers, and I know the data on this is still emerging, but there's some real, we all have a vested interest in supporting and retaining our teachers across that entire pipeline. So yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Bring up the really important thing. So I don't know if it's probably changed a bit. We know that approximately 30 to 50% of teachers leave the profession in the first 5 years.
Right.
Number one reason isn't because they didn't know how to teach math or science. It was because they had stress from dealing with classroom management problems. And think about that cost, at least the latest, this is a few years ago from a brief from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, costs $7 billion a year in the in teacher re-education of bringing new teachers. So there's some, if we, I think there's different levers here of who we, audience, if the money, those who have the money, guess what? Pay now or pay later. So invest more in the teacher preparation and you'll have much more retention.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Kim. We're going to shift to some of the questions that are coming in from our audience today. One of those was around, we have a listener from Chicago who was interested in work that's being done around caregivers and supporting that connection with caregivers and social emotional learning. And I will say, hopefully our CASEL team can drop into the chat. We have a caregiver discussion series, which actually was originated out of some work with Chicago Public Schools, and that does exactly this. It's sort of a 10-part discussion series where caregivers are leading, actually with other caregivers, discussions around these competencies, around them in their own lives, around how to support their students, around how to use them to engage with staff at parent-teacher conferences or whatever it may be. So it's been a powerful piece of work that we would love for you all to be using in your context as well. But Kim, what are you seeing about caregivers and social emotional learning?
Well, I think for sure, I think there's a couple of things. I think they're really hungry for the knowledge. I find that, it might have been 5 years ago, you have a session on this and, at a school with parents and caregivers showing up, and it might be a handful of people. Now, I think it's hundreds, so there's definitely increased attention, but looking for actual practical advice of what to do. I think we really need to bring that in. And I feel that, and I think, if I think of community school partnerships with family school partnerships, we really have to work and figure out how to make them work the best. I know the last SEL exchange really focused on this topic, but I think we really need to figure out what are the ways to, and I think on the one hand, I feel learn help give them the skills, but actually learn from them, really use them as our partners to learn from, as people who could bring in really good information, as well. So it really is a partnership that's collaborative. It isn't just a one way.
Thank you for that. We had a question about how SEL leaders can address veteran educators who may be somewhat skeptical to bringing in new programs, whether for students or adults. And I know you mentioned that as that skepticism as well in your comments. So curious what you've seen work in that case.
Yeah, I think so. First of all, I think we get frustrated sometimes with people who, with educators, and I'll talk about just educators in this, or teachers in particular, who might be hesitant to bring on these new programs. I think there's a couple of things. One is, they feel uncomfortable, and it's it doesn't feel right. And so they just are not sure if they'll do well, and they kind of feel really situated in their place. And I think sometimes we get frustrated with them and just say, come on, go with the times. Where I really like to always approach it with a compassionate lens and just say, we really have to have compassion. That is a difficult thing to do. And also the whole idea of focusing on your emotions, and, it wasn't something that was part of any conversation previously. And people have all their own social and emotional concerns or pain. You just don't know, so I just have to say, first, really try, get over your frustration and kind of have this compassionate lens. And then second, I feel that teachers, interestingly, often, they're not swayed by the research. I mean, not some of them are, I would say, but they're more swayed by a colleague who says, I'm doing this and this really works. And so to me, it would be about partnering them with a colleague who they really know, who they can help co-lead it with. I feel like so much as it's like, oh, do this, and they feel kind of funny. But if you have a really partner who you trust and who's connected, to use that as the way in. So I feel like the coaching models, the supportive, and actually I would just talk to them too and say, okay, what are some ways that we can, what are some easy ways to quick things to get this in? I think, but it's a difficult one because it's hard to change. And I feel like because transitions and change is disruptive and causes stress and anxiety, and we just have to really recognize that.
Yeah, you're bringing to mind one of an individual who actually became an SEL district lead in one of our partner districts, but started out as a very skeptical teacher, skeptical administrator, and was asked to do one of these programs, and then was finding that program was having impact on him in terms of his wellness. And, as you're teaching breathing techniques to second graders or problem solving techniques to second graders, he was trying them out and finding that there was some value there. So sometimes it's just that experiential piece as well. So thank you.
I love that. And I have to say, a recent area of research that really has begun to grow, and there's now more solid evidence for this, is, and we just conducted a study using the Mind Up program of showing that teachers who are implementing a program for the students actually have benefits for themselves. And that just say, so you're talking about this, a study of what happened in that example, but we now have empirical evidence showing that actually that's true, that teachers, we often feel that there's different ways we can go. We can go a pathway where they learn about teaching this to the students and then really find out that there's benefits to themselves, or they could have a program for themselves. And so there isn't just one road to this.
That's right. And you might have to try and iterate on all of those. That's great. Interesting question around what are some good tools for adults that have never worked with kids, thinking about school or after school or summer camp, to establish positive relationships and co-regulation strategies?
Yeah, I know. I love that question because I've worked a lot in the after school area for a long time, doing some work on students' participation in after school programs and the importance of that, but also with the young people, often the people who work in those out of school settings like YMCA and Boys and Girls Clubs and all those different settings, church and community centers and things like that. And it really is important to have them learn some of these strategies, I think, about how to create those positive relationships and the importance of those and the importance that they play in connecting to kids and knowing some things like that. There's a recent study one of my PhD students just did, and it certainly could be interesting to out of school time, is she did a study asking asking middle school students, what do teachers do to show they care? And then actually found, just, asked hundreds of middle school students, and it fell into these three categories of being calm, being clear, being kind. And really they said kind of, teachers who were, they felt were caring were calm. They didn't yell. They were calm. They talked to you. They were also clear. They were really clear in their instructions and how they communicated, and they were kind. They listened to you. They went out of their way, and so it's a neat framework to think about. How do you, and I have a brief on that we could share of what the students say, but, really helping them with the code. And I think the other thing, we just brought this up about the idea of teaching. So if they're using some kind of program and strategies, and there's lots of things that could be used in the after school space from a number of different programs. I'm thinking of Stephanie Jones's kernels of, using the SEL kernels. I was just going to mention the Mind Up program is a program I've been using quite a bit, been doing the research on quite a bit, where there's these brain breaks and there's different things. But even them learning about how to teach it to the students could have implications for them as well. So I think there's several different ways. I love that in the co-regulation, I think it's really important. I think that it's innovative to think that these people who work in out of school time or expanded learning would be having something that's about their own well-being. And to me, even that, for them to learn those strategies is key.
Yeah, I love that, Kim. Well, this time has flown by for this conversation. And, I love that we touched on caregivers, community members, teachers, all of the adults that we sort of teed up at the beginning. And hopefully folks are leaving with some concrete ideas of how they can bring this into whatever piece of work that you're doing to serve young people. So Kim, would love to hear from you if you have a key takeaway from this conversation.
Well, several, but I'll just say, I'm just so grateful that we're having this conversation, that even elevating this discussion of the adult SEL isn't something I would have seen years ago. So I think that people paying attention to it, and to even have it as part of the conversation and the focus and thinking about how to integrate it. I think that's one thing I would say. I do think we have far to go. However, I feel that we need to, I'll raise again that we need to bring this association between adult well-being and child well-being into a public conversation. We need to raise it. Like, now we know, for example, early brain development, early childhood, we know how important that early brain development is. And that's part of, I think, a public knowledge about that. I think in the same way, we really need to really have a larger, conversation. There needs to be op-eds and, the New York Times. There needs to be things and, great, I guess, TikTok, maybe. I don't know. There's all kinds of ways that we get it out there so that people really know how important this is, along with some actual concrete strategies. And I find that, even like the 5 ways to do, adult SEL, that have good implications. But anyway, so yeah.
Oh, thank you for that, Kim. I think that was certainly connects to one of my key takeaways, which is really, how can we all be part of building this public awareness? And I think, we had an invitation in the chat to tweet your takeaways today to create that conversation around this work. And I think also really thinking about the ways that you can build this into structures and systems that, you talked about policy that's happening in British Columbia. We talked about entire districts that are creating a commitment to adult SEL, schools that are building practices to really honor and set aside that time for adult SEL. So I think all of these create part of the puzzle that we're trying to build, and looking forward to that. So for our intentional close today, and Kim mentioned the 3 signature practices, and we tried to build those into even a 1-hour webinar session where we cannot see you, but still building in those practices so that you had a warm welcome, so that you're having your own time to reflect and build this learning into your own practice. And then to close intentionally with, let's learn, think about what is one thing you might want to learn more about that you heard today. Is there a way that you can connect and collaborate with someone on today's topic or to share publicly? And can you model SEL in a given context even more intentionally than you may already be doing? Because we know you're already doing a lot in this way. So take a moment, jot that commitment down, tweet your key takeaway, mark your calendar for that learning or that connection. And we hope that you will carry this learning with you beyond just today.